Welcome everyone to another episode of ExploreTraveler. I'm your host, John Gentry, and today I just wanted to kind of give some brief updates, what we've learned so far in our Asian travels, what we think about some of the areas of where we live, and just kind of give you a very short synopsis of, what we see. So, as some of you may or may not know, we relocated earlier in the year to Asia, and we operate out of Malaysia for now. And in doing so, we've discovered quite a few interesting things. We've lived in Singapore before, we lived in Taiwan, and we visited a lot of these countries, but living there full time gives us a slightly different perspective. So first, we spend most of our time on the island of Penang, and we venture out of there into mainland Malaysia, or we take flights over to Thailand, to Cambodia, Indonesia, etc. Costs. So if you stay within the region, costs of flights from Penang to, say, Thailand or Singapore or Indonesia, they're very reasonable. They're very cost effective. If you start getting involved where United States or Europe, there is a ton of taxes, a ton of extra fuel charges, and prices. They're not just high, they're exorbitantly high. There's various reasons for that, but it has to do with the fact that in those particular countries, those currencies are much stronger, I think, than some of the ones over here, and so it tacks on hundreds of percents higher on the plane ticket. So when you're in this region, you definitely want to stay in this region as much as possible in order to preserve costs. Now, you may want to go home once a year, etc., but that's up to you. That's up to your budget. But just keep those things into consideration and don't expect prices to necessarily go down. Cost of food. Well, as with everything else across the world, food inflation is a problem here as well. It only becomes doable for us because most of our income comes from US dollars. We in turn convert that into Malaysian ringgit or whatever we need, and so we save there because the dollar has been stronger recently, and so that is made up for inflation. But inflation is actually, it's quite high. I'm not sure what it is, but it seems like it's over 10%. Cost of fuel is a little cheaper here in Malaysia, but it has been rising, and I'm sure that's pulling a lot of pressure on the locals who rely on fuel for their scooters and their automobiles. Cost of hotels can vary. It seems like there are some hotels that, such as the Shangri-La, that have maybe a certain standard and a certain clientele, which I would have to say they're more Chinese and nationals or Chinese from other areas of Asia. So that particular chain, I've noticed, holds a premium on price. Marriott does as well, but I have actually found it to be a little on the cheaper side than some of the Shangri-La hotels. Now, if you were to switch to something that's used more by the upper middle class of Malaysia, for example, then you're going to find that those hotels are actually just as good. Sometimes they're better, and the price is significantly less. I've seen prices anywhere between 10 and 50% difference. So, kind of keep that into consideration. All right, safety. So I think people get confused, or they've learned to believe things that aren't necessarily true. As with every single country on this planet, you have crime. Now, if your lifestyle takes you into contact with that crime, such as visiting places of ill repute or very rough drinking establishments, etc., then you are going to run in with some of the criminal element. So your chances or risks of having to deal with that obviously go up exponentially. But the reverse is also true, right? But you do need to be aware of your surroundings, as you should always be, to ensure that you're not an easy mark or a target for criminal activity. And just because you stand out, you don't blend in visually with the rest of the culture and the people within the region, that doesn't mean that everything is necessarily unsafe. Okay? We spend quite a bit of time in Malaysia and Indonesia this year, and we definitely stand out. We're taller than everybody, we're lighter skinned for sure. Our hair color is different. Um, it's just we do not blend in at all. However, from a safety perspective, we actually feel safer in these countries than we do in our own home country. Crime is much lower. Um, Homelessness is, I don't want to say it's non-existent, because it obviously has to be, but it's so low that it's barely noticeable unless you just happen to get to the right spot where you notice there's a few people here and there. But for the most part, there's not a lot of homelessness. Um, Elder people are taken care of by their families, and younger people are expected to, be a productive members of their society, doing something that's considered acceptable. Now, there are people who break the rules. There's people who go out of those expected norms, and yeah, they could end up being shunned by their family or their tribe or etc. But for the most part, people here are pretty law-abiding in general, and criminal mischief is very low. Now, however, we can go from I think I just want to use a little bit of example. Is I've seen more unusually, and it might not be considered criminal in that particular country, such as Thailand, but in Thailand I see a lot more homeless people. I've seen people on sidewalks, crippled people on sidewalks begging for money. You don't see that stuff in Malaysia or Indonesia. It's just unheard of. Um, Now, I mean, obviously these crippled people still exist here as well, but for some reason they're better taken care of, and there's less of a sense of usury that I think happens in Malaysia in particular. And so, kind of keep that in mind. Let's say you wanted to buy property. Let's just switch to a little economics here again. If you wanted to buy property, you would notice that the laws are more favorable for you here in Malaysia than in other countries. A lot of Southeast Asian countries do not allow foreigners to own land. However, here in Malaysia, you can. I think there still is some rules on what you can and cannot do as a foreign national and non-citizen. But for the most part, you can buy property here, both standing and condos, and you can even buy, I think, farmland, actually. So you have more options here if you felt you needed to relocate for other reasons that, are yours to consider. Um, and of course, we hear everything that's on the news. We are aware, but we've spent some time this year in Doha, Qatar, and quite frankly, we had another marvelous experience. Um, we had no issues. Everything was clean. Everybody was exceptionally polite, and we had a very good time. I mean, you always want to follow the expected norms of your host country. Just because something is allowed in your home country, that does not mean it is considered allowable in your host country. So always keep that in mind when you visit other places. You should always respect their cultures, even if you do not agree with everything that they practice. So you do not have to agree with it to necessarily respect it. And I think that is something that people need to take into consideration, because there may be reasons for these certain rules or regulations that you do not fully understand, and you do not know why they came to be in place to begin with. So kind of keep those things, in consideration, right? So all in all, this has been a great experience. We are enjoying ourselves. The food is top notch, and it is amazing the fusion of Indian, Malay, and Chinese food cultures, and the dishes that they create here are unique to Penang in particular. But even when you go off of Penang onto the mainland or even into KL, you get that fusion taking place as well. Now, something that we get asked sometimes is there other foreigners? Yes, there is. Most foreigners hang out in two places in Malaysia. Um, I think the biggest one is probably Kuala Lumpur, but Penang has a large expat community. And when I say expat community, I mean that includes everybody that is not Malaysian, okay? So you've got people living here from mainland China, from Hong Kong, Australia, the United States, every country in Europe, other countries, a lot of Koreans, Japanese. And so there are people that have been here in Malaysia for a very long time, or they could be second, third, fourth generations from those countries, and they got their own little communities going. Like there's a pretty strong Korean community here. Obviously, the Indians, there's a lot of Indians here, so they have a strong community, and some of them they're very well established, multi-generational, go back to the colonial days when they were brought here from India. Chinese culture is very broad, so we should never just say, oh, it's Chinese. Well, Chinese comes in many different flavors, right? And so China is a very big country. A lot of people immigrated from parts of China that are totally different then than they are now, but they brought that culture and that food and those flavors and those styles of cooking with them. And so when they did that, they created a unique style of food here in Penang in particular. And so if you decide to come to Penang, you should consider that this is kind of the foodie capital of the world. So if you're looking for an explosion of flavors, Penang is definitely the place to go. Um, KL or Kuala Lumpur, as it's called, is equally as good in my opinion, but I think it's much bigger, and you're going to have to deal with a lot more traffic than you would here in Penang. Okay, so let me just kind of go over ease of living. So for a long time, before every country had to deal with certain viruses, delivery was already in existence in Southeast Asia. And there's a couple companies in particular, but I'm just going to mention some of the big ones here. One of them is called Grab. Another one's called Food Panda. But Grab is definitely, I think, the go-to for the most part. They're very efficient. They have a great online system and app, and they have a ton of food. Almost everybody who has a restaurant here, big or small, also serves stuff to Grab, and Grab takes it and delivers it to them. And so you can get pretty much anything you want here in Penang within an hour, of when you order it. When we get it, things that are close, within 15 minutes sometimes. So, everything from if you want to get coffee lattes from Starbucks to you want a 4-course Indian cuisine or you want Lebanon, whatever you want, it's available. So there's a lot of different options and a lot of things for you to consider. So I think I'm going to wrap it up here for now. but wanted to say, thank you for all those who follow us here on the podcast on the various different channels. And if you're on, one of those channels and allows you to follow us, please consider that. If you're on our YouTube podcast section, make sure that you follow, hit the bell so you get notifications of all of our travel updates. During the week, we'll post a few shorts just to kind of show you some general ideas of what's going on. And then we do try to make an effort to post a larger video once a week, which could be anything from a restaurant review or something involved in tourism. So until next time, everybody, travel on.